Welcome to Tigray Media House. My name is Maliti Berhana Meskel. It's been 23 months since the war on Tigray began. And just this week, we saw devastating footage of bombing that happened in several cities in Tigray, watching families dig their loved ones out of the rubble. It was a very devastating scene to see. Eritrea is no longer hiding its involvement in the war on Tigray. This has become an understood fact. The report is that tens of thousands of soldiers are dying. On the heels of this information, a report was released by the Independent Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia. Remember, this was the commission that representatives on the UN Human Rights Council tried to block the formation of, and then subsequently tried to block the funding of. But thanks to 11 nations who abstained, including 6 African nations, the commission was formed, and we now have their report. Here to discuss that report with us is Professor Mukesh Kapila. He is a doctor, a professor of global health and humanitarian affairs at the University of Manchester. He's worked with the largest humanitarian organizations in the world, including the UN, where he led the UN's country mission in Sudan. Professor Kapila, thank you so much for being here today. We're grateful for your time.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here again. I wish I didn't have to be back again, but here we are months later, still discussing the subject.
That's right. You were on my show a year and a half ago, and I'll never forget one of the things that you said. You said that there's a pathology to genocide, and it was clear as day what was happening in Tigray. You called it genocide before anybody else would. Clearly, the world has caught on now. Even this report references an intent to destroy in Tigray. There's lots of points that we can examine, but for you, as someone who studies genocide, I'm wondering what stood out to you in the report and the subsequent conversation around the report. I want to point out one thing that was incredibly alarming to me was how there was an intent to block the investigation. First of all, there were 3 investigators. They had 2 full-time individuals who were helping them investigate, but due to lack of financing, lack of access, there was really only 2 true months of investigation. They were in Addis Ababa for 6 days and were not allowed to go into many of the areas that were impacted. The report says that the Ethiopian government blocked access, either didn't respond or delayed their response to questions from the commission. Eritrea flat out refused to be involved, but still 185 people were interviewed. Most of the interviews were done remotely, and there were significant findings, including enough findings to suggest that there is an intent to destroy. That really stood out to me, that if that was the limited time and access, and still this conclusion was reached, it makes me wonder what would be found if true access was given to investigators. And eventually we will have access and we will have information, but I can only imagine the devastation. So what stood out to you in this report?
I think the independent experts have to be complimented on having got as far as it did, as you said, with so many constraints upon them and attempts to undermine their work. Clearly, there was much to hide. That's why I think both the Ethiopian and the Eritrean governments did not collaborate. And by the way, just to add to your list of constraints, the report also says that several UN agencies refused to provide critical information, even though this was a resolution of a UN-constituted body, the Commission, the Human Rights Council. So, and all those factors got in the way of the investigation. So I think the commissioners are to be complimented on producing it. Again, in the context of, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which hasn't exactly covered itself with glory in terms of its previous investigations on this particular matter. So to be honest with you, I had extremely low expectations from this investigation and this inquiry. So I was, if I can use the word pleasantly surprised for an unpleasant subject. The report is actually devastating, and it indicates in the measured language of the report, the measured language of bureaucrats, that it is almost certain that grave crimes against humanity have been committed, and that these are typified by certain signature acts, which give us confidence in the findings. Like, for example, the use of sexual violence, which is a signature act in genocidal crimes.
Well, why do you think? I think that's interesting. You said the UN agencies, there were some who refused to provide information. Is that a survival tactic? Is it because if they get involved, they can be pushed out? We've seen various humanitarian organizations pushed out of the region. Is that why, or is there more? Is there something more sinister to the lack of participation by some of these agencies? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a combination of individuals in decision-making positions within these UN agencies, especially inside the country, and their global leadership in the capitals, who took politically motivated decisions not to collaborate. I had the same thing when I was the UN resident humanitarian coordinator in Sudan, and after I left the Security Council. In the end, asked for an inquiry, and that's a Security Council, much more powerful body. And the UN agencies simply refused to collaborate. The UN would not even release my information that I had produced as the head of the United Nations in the system, and I had to provide it clandestinely from my own laptop, which I had taken away with me once I left Sudan. So I think the lack of cooperation of the so-called humanitarian agencies who call themselves humanitarian agencies and who speak about human security and all the principles we talk about is, I think, even more disgusting and reprehensible. You expect the Ethiopian federal authorities not to collaborate. And obviously, I would have been very surprised if Eritrea had not collaborated. But the lack of cooperation from the guardians of the values of the UN is, I think, the most appalling expression of cynicism in this whole exercise.
The report details how civilians were targeted repeatedly. It starts with the shelling in Mekelle toward the early part of the war. And it says scores of people were killed in that shelling, and there was no sign of military targets or anything in the area. It also says while the federal government held the capital of Tigray, scores of civilians were killed. There's also a significant conversation about the precision-guided drones and those striking civilians as well. Some people are surprised to see that in black and white. They flat out deny that there's any credibility to the report. But we have photos, we have videos, we have journalists who've been on the ground, we have humanitarian organizations who are telling us that this is happening. This report now is telling us this is happening. If we can't convince even the most basic average Ethiopian of what's happening so they can ask their government to stop, how will we ever stop the genocide? How can we get people to take this seriously if even in spite of all of the evidence, it's being denied? I mean, you just said the UN organizations have even refused to provide information. So who helps people who are under genocide?
Well, I think the fact that many Ethiopians still regrettably deny the heinous acts that have been committed around the Tigray conflict, Tigray war, just indicates the nature of the processes that have matured over the past 2-3 years that we are talking here about. In other words, the misinformation, the dehumanization, the politicization of identity. And we know that those who manipulate such phenomena, who tend to be those who are in command of the systems for manipulation, which is basically the authorities. This is the National Federal Ethiopian authorities who use both propaganda and access to information and manipulating that information. So the ordinary public of Ethiopia, it's not surprising that they only know one side of the story, and what they know is deeply controlled. And again, this should not surprise us, because this is exactly what has happened in relation to the Russia-Ukraine war, where many Russians think that what Putin is telling them is a gospel truth, and what the other side is telling them is all lies. So we're having exactly the same thing here, and the other aspect to all this is as more and more ordinary Ethiopians have got sucked into this war, not necessarily because they are very fond of it, or not necessarily because they wanted it, but the more they have been manipulated into it, the more they have got a stake in it. And that stake means that they have been painted into a corner where there is only one thing possible, and that is they either have to win at all costs. This is the Ethiopian side against the Tigrayan side, or they have to bear the consequences of losing the war eventually. And the third factor in this is that my feeling is, and I see this in other situations where I've studied similar conflicts in the past, is that when the people in their heart of hearts know, and it doesn't matter who you are in the world, but when you in your heart of hearts know that your cause is rubbish, and that you are on you are going to go down, then your position gets more and more solidified, as if to make a last stand, even though you're going to perish with that position. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that in Ethiopia, there's a lot of desperation around the country, and people don't see any other alternatives other than, of course, to overthrow the regime of Abiy Ahmed. And that is not an easy thing to do, though I suspect, to answer your other question, that's probably what's going to need to happen if you're going to see progress.
Excuse me. Another alarming finding by the commission, they said, and this is a quote, hate speech, attacking and dehumanizing ethnic groups, a key indicator of future atrocities, shows no sign of abating. And so it is true, we saw these horrific bombings this week of non-military targets, of civilian targets. Do you find the response to this genocide in Tigray equal to what you've seen in other places? I mean, it sounds like you said that earlier. How do we raise the temperature? How do we get people to take this seriously around the world? It's clear that the Ethiopian government is controlling information. So the average Ethiopian is not saying no. I think there is a movement or a feeling now that something is awry, that they can't continue this way, but no one is really, there isn't a groundswell movement to stop what's happening. So how, first of all, is the response in Tigray similar to what you've seen in other genocides in terms of exterior, world powers trying to stop what's happening? But also, what do we do? How do we, I feel like this genocide is playing out in real time before us. We have video, we have, testimony that's coming out, and there's lots of evidence. What do we do?
Well, first to say that, yes, it's typical of other genocidal conflicts that I have lived through. Second to say that, and this is very sad for me to say that, this is a very young conflict. It's only been going for 2 odd years, right? Even though it feels like a lifetime, and it is beyond a lifetime for those who are in the middle of the suffering. Don't let me underestimate, that for individual, in terms of individual impact. But the fact is, by historical experience of conflicts and wars, this is a young conflict, and it's got a lot of steam in it, and it's not ready for solving yet. If you look at trends in conflicts, including genocidal ones, they tend to last longer and longer and longer, because modern warfare is a multidimensional warfare, and therefore it is not simply a question of winning or losing on the battlefront. And nowadays, of course, it is not the soldiers who are on the battlefront; it is the civilians on the battlefront. So what that means is that, and coming back to Tigray Ethiopia conflict, with Eritrean involvement, this is just entering into the next phase. And the next phase is that now all pretense has gone. We know that terrible things which only activists were saying on the ground, or some pioneering journalists had identified, are now common knowledge. Even commissions of inquiry are saying these kinds of things. And if you talk to people privately unrecorded, they will say that yes, what's going on is terrible, and they acknowledge that bad things, terrible things are happening. You see, so with no pretense there is nothing to hold you back. Now there's only one thing to go for, and that is total war. So this is the genocidal conflict entering the next phase of annihilation, where and all that has happened so far, there'll be no point of it if you didn't enter that phase now. I'm speaking to the perspective of the genocidaire. If I was a person scheming to get rid of all the people, to eliminate these people, there's no point in stopping now. You got to do and finish the job. This is what Hitler tried to do with the Jews in Europe. Why stop at 1 million or 2? He was forced to stop when he reached 6 million, but otherwise it would have gone and on and on and on and on. And so you got to distinguish also between the overall conflict between opposing sides, and within the conflict, the mass atrocities and the genocidal content of that. So they are both component of each other, they parallel each other, and they, in a sense, feed off each other. And the logic of a genocidal mindset is to complete the job. So my very somewhat depressing message is that this ain't going to be ending anytime soon. And then your question was what to do about it, what can we do about it? Well, I think my hope lies that not in the UN, which is unable to act. Even UN humanitarian agencies cannot do much other than bring relief when they have a small access to do so. And the Security Council is neutralized, as everyone knows. It is if the African continent and the African Union, or beyond the African Union, I think the African Union itself is no better than the UN Security Council. So I don't know if there are some African states elsewhere who might show leadership and through that exert pressure both within the African Union and bilaterally. I see no sign of that. I can't identify individual African countries who might take the leadership on that, unfortunately, but I don't see any other hope on that.
Wow. That is very bleak. That's a very bleak message. Yeah. The commission, at this point, no one is denying there's an intent to destroy. Like you said, this is actually now known, which is, I guess my question is the UN as helpless as it appears? I mean, let me just read what this commission said. They said the federal government and allied regional state governments have implemented a widespread range of measures designed to systematically deprive the population of Tigray of material and services indispensable for its survival, including healthcare, shelter, water, sanitation, education, and food. Has the UN used all of the tricks that it has? I mean, can they do anything else? And to add to that, I know there's this, and the report references the 2014 UN Framework for Analysis of Atrocity Crimes. Isn't there a response required when you have these triggers that are being set off? How do you get to the R2P? How do you get to the next step of that? I mean, or was that framework just set up so that you would know that a genocide is happening?
Well, just to dismiss the R2P, which the acronym stands for Responsibility to Protect. But as I have said ever since it started, and I was part of the discussion many years ago on this, R2P really stands for the responsibility to procrastinate. And invoking R2P has, to my knowledge, never prevented a single conflict. Maybe a small skirmish here or there it might have prevented, but it has never actually done anything at all. It should be buried where it belongs as an academic footnote somewhere. Mm. Now, I think you're right that when all the different thresholds have been exceeded, which are required in kind of UN experience and jurisprudence and and previous case history, then there is a responsibility to respond. The problem is that the collective UN relies on the assets of member states to be able to mount a response. It doesn't have an army of its own. It has no resources of its own. It relies on appealing for member states to put resources into whatever instrument it wishes to deploy, like, for example, this investigation that we're talking about. So when member states refuse to do that, then the UN cannot act. Of course, Antonio Guterres, the current Secretary General, who will probably go down in history as the most cowardly of the Secretary Generals in recent history, could have shown greater leadership at an early stage, could have been stronger in holding up the mirror to the world a bit more, and he could have asserted a little bit more of his own position on this topic, but he chose not to do that because he was looking for votes for his re-election, and now, quite honestly, there are other fish to fry. So yes, the UN should respond. It is supposed to respond, but partly it lacks the leadership to do so. If its own agencies will not collaborate, what do you expect the political wing to do? And then what do you expect the UN to do when the most powerful states in the world, those who are in the Security Council, themselves are unwilling to act, or they block action by others? So in this particularly true in the case, for example, of China, which is a member of the Security Council and which has systematically blocked any meaningful discussion on it. And then countries like India, who are not permanent members, but who are important friends of Ethiopia, culturally and historically speaking, their doctrine, foreign policy doctrine on non-interference, means that they don't interfere in such circumstances around the world. We've just had a meeting of the UN General Assembly. We've just had a meeting of the UN Security Council, which took place at the time of the General Assembly. There were discussions on many conflicts, including this one. But by and large, the countries of the world met. They shed private tears. They expressed private frustrations, but collectively and individually, they are not in a position to act.
Wow. Seems like that type of inaction is just going to embolden future tyrants and dictators who want to attack their own people. I want to ask you about the use of technology and drones in this genocide. I feel like we're seeing something interesting because, and then the report significantly talks about, these drones and how they're supposed to be precision guided, laser focused, and yet they're still hitting all these civilian targets. What's interesting in Tigray and in Ethiopia is there's a complete communication blackout. There's no technology. So the phones, the internet, all of this. And I believe it's the longest communication blockade in history on the people of Tigray. So you have that, but at the same time, you have a government that is using drones to destroy its people. What are your thoughts about how technology has played out in this genocide? I know that a lot of these drones came from Turkey, and I was reading last week about Burkina Faso and drones from Turkey and the impact in that area. And I feel like there's a larger conversation about the impact of drones, and particularly in Africa, and what this could mean for Africans moving forward. What are your thoughts on the use of these drones and the potential impact on how it's easier to go to war and commit these atrocities?
Well, absolutely. I think drones are a relatively low-cost way of waging war. And drones have become more and more sophisticated and lethal in the process. Now, Turkey is completely within its rights to sell armaments to any country, because as far as I know, Ethiopia is not under a United Nations Security Council mandated arms embargo. Right?
That's true.
So if Turkey wishes Turkey or any other country, China or any other country, wishes to sell armaments to Ethiopia, or by incidentally, if anyone wants to do the same to the Tigrayan side, they are within the rights to do so. Now, whether morally you would want to do that is another question. But in the way world affairs are conducted, we barely rely on legality, let alone on morality. And there are no laws on morals. So, coming to details of your question, I think I was impressed by what it said in this commission report, that the nature of modern technology-based warfare is that it allows greater accuracy. It allows the operator technology to target better. So if you hit civilian targets, then it can only be through deliberate means, because this is not just an accident that happens in the fog of war. It can happen anywhere in the fog of war. So that part of the report, I think, goes with what we know about the use of these technologies in modern warfare. And I think it only strengthens the case that these are deliberate attacks against civilian targets, and therefore they amount to both war crimes and crimes against humanity. Mm-hmm. Now, what this also means is that the logical extension of that is that we will see more and more use of such technology on a wider scale, with, for example, and the blocking the internet is use of technology in reverse, because today's conflicts are in populations who are dependent on the internet, whether it's banking or whether it's energy supply from their power plants or payment of wages or whatever, if you like, you see. So those kinds of technologies, negative and positive impacts of technology, are actually the logical way to do these things. Having said that, technology can also be a means of survival and a means of resistance. Because one thing we can say is, unlike in the Nazi times, we only realized what was going on well into the Holocaust. And the worst only came out after after the camps were liberated. We actually know so much detail about what is going on, right down to geolocations of targets and individual names of people affected and all those kinds of things. And that's also a blessing of technology.
Mm-hmm. It's a blessing and it's a frustration, because there's so much information, and it's the lack of action is it's hard. It's difficult. You said we barely rely on legality, let alone morality. I think that's really a powerful statement. In our last conversation a year and a half ago, you had talked about how every genocide has a signature, and the signature in this genocide is rape. The report speaks to this in some detail. They interviewed 24 rape survivors who talked about sexual slavery. I'll give a trigger warning, but there was a lactating mother who said her nipples were burned. There was a woman who said she was raped with a knife. A quote from the report says, the attackers expressed an intent to render the victims infertile by permanently destroying their sexual and reproductive health. The rapes were accompanied by dehumanizing language that suggested an intent to destroy the Tigrayan ethnicity. That's genocide.
Yes, I think sexual violence, unfortunately, takes place in conflict and wars. But what makes sexual violence a genocidal act is the intention behind it. So these horrendous and gruesome types of rapes, they are not just sexual. They are actually, above all else, expressions of extreme violence. And there are so many cases of the accompanying statements that have been reported also in the media beyond this report, which indicate that the intent of the rapists behind this was an attempt to destroy the identity of a group of people. And the other thing why this is a genocidal crime in this context is the organized nature of it. These were not random acts committed by renegade men, which also happens in lawless or war-torn situations. But these were egregious acts. And they appear to point towards a command and control, meaning they were acts of strategy and they were organized, which makes them a genocidal act.
Wow. We're coming to the end. I just have a couple more questions for you. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, it's clear that Tigrayans have not given up. They're still resisting. They are still fighting. Still, there's no media in the area, but we're getting some information. Ethiopia is still collaborating with Eritrea, sending tens of thousands of troops into Tigray. We heard recently from the Tigrayan authorities that 93,000 enemy soldiers were killed in the past 39 days. If this is true, regardless of how this ends, how is anyone going to be okay when this is all said and done? So regardless of how this ends, with so much devastation, with so much death, with so much destruction, how, victim or perpetrator, how can anyone survive this? How are they going to come out with any sense of like a normal functioning mind and life?
Well, I have got one pessimistic and one optimistic point to make in response. The pessimistic point is what I've already said before, that this conflict is not ready for solving yet. And what that unfortunately means is there's a lot of pain and suffering ahead. And we have seen vignettes of it, and we have seen this happening on an industrial scale already. The numbers people have attempted to compute the numbers, and I think those are underestimates, the thousands affected or the hundreds of thousands affected by starvation, by rape, or other forms of brutality. But yet, that's not enough to trigger an end to the conflict. So there is going to be more suffering. Now, but I have a counterpoint, which is that the last couple of years have also indicated how resilient people are. The fact is that even as they suffer, they have not given up. Even as they have literally their bodies and minds have borne personally and physically and mentally and emotionally and in any way you can imagine these brutalities. Their resistance has evoked a massive cost on the other side as well. Okay, in this respect, this is very different from the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews. And there's a lot of controversy in this area, as to why the Jews did not resist in Europe. And there is a whole literature out there saying, oh, well, why did the Jews go to the Warsaw Ghetto and allow themselves to be slaughtered? And I don't want to get into that debate, which is very emotional in its own particular way, and I'm not an expert in that. See, but one thing was very clear, that the Nazis had their way for a very long period of time, and the whole thing was reversed only when the rest of the world intervened and started extracting costs from the Nazis for their genocidal policies. Now, what's interesting in what is happening here in Tigray is that the Tigrayan people are actually forcing the aggressors in Ethiopia and Eritrea to bear a huge cost. So this is, they've realized that there is no succor from outside. Nobody's going to come to their aid. One, this is practically very difficult to do because of the geographical nature of Tigray, where it is, and how to get to it. And secondly, almost the whole world is not against Tigray. Many sympathize with Tigray, but they are in the pocket of the Ethiopians. Okay, so under those circumstances, the Tigrayans are learning that if they're going to go down and be eliminated, then they're going to go and do that after extracting a huge cost from the oppressors. Now that gives me cause for hope that actually the genocide will never be completed. And that's also a point of hope from history. If you look back in history, no genocide in history has actually ever been completed. So even though I've given you a pretty stark message in our conversation, the point is history is on Tigray's side. It's no consolation for people who are living through history at the present time. But in the end, genocides never win. They never do. So if Tigrayan people are strong and the leaders are wise, and it's very important that Tigrayan leaders, whether in the TPLF or whatever leadership there is in Tigray, civilian and military, they need to show extreme wisdom in keeping up the morale of their people, their resolve, including their fighting resolve and their survival resolve to overcome this oppression and this genocidal violence that is inflicted against them. And on that, I'm reasonably optimistic. We can't take anything for granted. And just because certain things happen in history and will happen again, doesn't mean to say that new histories are not often created also, if you like. Absolutely. But in that sense, my mixed message is there's more suffering to come, there's more war to come, and it ain't over yet. But I think in the end, the Tigrayans will survive and will go forward.
That is our prayer for sure. Recently, there have been a lot of think pieces about Abiy Ahmed and Ethiopia and how this ends and what's next. I'm curious on what you think, what your thoughts are on Abiy and the way out for Ethiopia and Ethiopians. I also recently, and I know you saw this too, but the Rwandan genocide financier, Felicien Kabuga, he's 89 years old, and his trial recently started at The Hague for financing the Rwandan genocide. So I think that's really interesting too. So your thoughts on that, and also, what is the way out now for Abiy Ahmed? Everyone is debating this, and a lot are saying the only way for Ethiopia to survive is to push him out. He's got to go. What are your thoughts on that?
I think they're right. I think, firstly, Abiy Ahmed bears principal responsibility for the genocidal violence on Tigray. There is no question about that. Then, of course, he can't do it on his own. He hasn't been doing it on his own. There is a whole coterie of people, both thinkers and doers and army and civilians and policymakers and all the rest of it, and financiers, talking about financiers. So, but he's the leader. In the same way that Hitler was the principal architect of the Holocaust in Europe, in the same way that we know who the leader was of the genocide in Rwanda, or Pol Pot in Cambodia, or in my personal case, my nemesis, the Sudanese dictator in Khartoum, right? So the individual cannot take responsibility for whatever is done by his acts of omission or commission. So Abiy Ahmed Ali, Nobel laureate, president Prime Minister of Ethiopia, there is no question he's the principal genocidaire. Now, coming to this trial in The Hague of an 89-year-old man who was a financial architect of the Rwandan genocide, two interesting points. The first is, in order to be convicted of genocide, you don't have to be the one who actually, pulls bullet or does the rape or any of these acts. If you have enabled it in a strategic way, if you have guided it by your ideas and by the enabling framework that you've created amongst your followers, then you're as guilty as a poor soldier in the front who's doing the dirty work. And Abiy Ahmed and his coterie should recognize that, should remember that. Thirdly, when it comes to crimes against humanity, there is no statute of limitations. In humanitarian terms, we might say, well, let this 89-year-old man go to hell in peace. What is going to be served by, doing this? Same thing happened, incidentally, with the Pol Pot guy only recently in Cambodia, whose verdict was confirmed after decades, right? But the reason, of course, you see, I hope this 89-year-old will be treated with generosity and humanity in his physical conditions, meaning put in prison and given all the medical and other help that any other human being needs. Because if you don't do that, then we're as inhuman as anyone else, if you like. Having said that, his conviction is important for those who are left behind, the current generation of Rwandans who are trying to get over the legacy, and their children, now into the second generation. And therefore, it's very, very important. So similarly, it doesn't matter whether Abiy Ahmed is 89 years old before he appears in front of an international court. It's important that that happens, and others around him. So I think knowing that in the end you can't evade justice, and that's another lesson, optimistic lesson from history, that international justice or justice is often little, often late, but if its wheels start grinding, nothing can stop it.
That's right.
So in that sense, I think the architects of the Tigray genocide should be extremely worried. They are marked men and women. Enjoy their time while they can, if you can call that looking over your shoulder every minute and being pilloried by the rest of the world and having brought your country to with a great nation like Ethiopia, brought to being synonymous with evil when it comes to the world opinion of at least the enlightened soul. What can be said? Absolutely. All the more reason to be actually totally determined, one, in winning the war in Tigray, even if it extracts more human costs, as I'm sure it will, but equally determinedly, not to simply go for peace at any cost. Peace is only worth having if it is a just peace, which means justice for the sake of those who have suffered already and who are going to carry on suffering. So this is why I don't agree with the AU peacekeeping and all these ill-informed peace efforts of the UN envoys and the AU envoys, and even some companies, Americans and others. They think, right, we must dampen the whole thing down, reduce the violence, and then love and peace will happen. Unfortunately, history has suggested you only have to look at Bosnia to realize that actually freezing a conflict through ill-considered efforts, rather than letting violence run its course, in the long run, will actually cost more lives. So I'm not in favor of peace at any cost. Only a just peace, and only with accountability that accompanies this peace will that peace be sustainable.
Wow, you said so many things there. But what sticks out to me, if you enabled the genocide in any way, you're as guilty as the soldier. Here in the United States, there are two what are being called the Ethiopian peace bills that are running through both the Senate and the House that will hold people accountable in the diaspora who are flaming, who are fanning the flames of war and genocide, including if they financially support or use their platforms to prolong the suffering of all of these people in Ethiopia and especially in Tigray. So hopefully those will move forward and become law. So I guess my last question, then I want to give you the final thoughts on where we are today. The one thing that I just want to ask you personally, I know the three experts who are on this commission, human rights experts, it's Kari Betty Murungi, Stephen Ratner, and Radhika Kumaraswamy from Sri Lanka, the United States, and from Kenya. There's a lot of criticism and an attempt to sort of smear these individuals, and especially the representative from Kenya. So Betty, she's a human rights lawyer, I believe. it's always easier to attack the African woman, I feel like. But anyways, all of them have been attacked by the pro-war trolls. They're very persistent. And I know you're constantly attacked as well, but it hasn't stopped you from speaking up. It hasn't stopped you from calling it what it is. I guess my question is, does your heart get weary? Do you ever just feel like this is too much? And how do you keep going? How do you keep going in spite of all of the attacks on your character? I mean, people say very crude things. How do you keep going?
Well, I think first to say that the more I get attacked, the more determined I get. Because in a sense, it's a kind of a validation that if what I'm saying, in a sense, arouses such a lot of ire in a certain constituency, and not the ire in another constituency, which I respect, then there must be something appropriate in what I'm saying, something valuable what I'm saying. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, yes, it's annoying. For example, I have to take extra security precautions. For example, I have to, look after my, and I don't mean digital security, I mean physical security, because I've had death threats. And I've been no stranger to death threats in my previous life as well. And there is a certain irritation in that I have to go through certain checks and rituals. Just like, when a pilot takes off with the plane, he has to go through half an hour of checks and things with his dials and things before the plane takes off. So for me, it's become second nature to look after my physical security. Digital security goes without saying. With the physical security, that's the thing you see. And I've got used to that. And it's possible that one day it will not be enough, but that will be the price to pay. Now, so that's what irritates, because it wastes my time. However, that's not the most important thing. I think the thing that really motivates me and keeps me going is that I don't have the luxury to give up. I mean, if I was actually sitting in Tigray, in Mekelle, being bombed, or in some highland village, worrying where I'm going to eat next, or worried about my family, then I might become more pragmatic of what I will do, or tolerate or not tolerate. But when I admire the courage of the people I hear about in Tigray, and the same thing happened, by the way, when I was dealing with the people of Darfur. What struck me was, how on earth could they continue against all of that was going on? And I was a first-hand witness to the genocide. I was in the middle of the genocide, not witness. I was in the genocide. So I think, and then when I feel tired and slightly nonplussed by all of this, and then I say to myself, I don't have the luxury to give up. Because if these people don't, if these people seem to keep on going, I'm infinitely more privileged and infinitely better resourced, supported, and protected, despite all my detractors. And if I give up, what would be the message being sent to these people? Okay, many people have given up because they're not supporting Tigray in the Security Council, or they're not providing them with defensive weapons, or they are not providing them with the wherewithal to save lives. Okay, people have given up in an organizational sense. That's what African Union has done. It's given up. That's what the UN has done. It has given up. That is what major powers like China and others have done. They've given up, if you like, organizationally given up. Mm-hmm. But if they have given up, it's all the more reason that individuals don't give up, in a way. No. Yeah, and if I was to give up, then I would be sending the same hopeless signals that these organizations have been sending. Now, I may not be able to do much in practical terms to help Tigray, unfortunately. I'm not 89, but I'm getting on, and I don't know which end of the gun is which, and I'm hardly going to be taking up weapons, tempted as I may be from time to time, but I'm not a fighter. I'm not a combatant, and I don't preach violence. So I can't become a kind of fighter for freedom. Like, for example, my grandfather was when he was rebelling against British colonial rule in India. I mean, he was a young man in those days, and he actually did his stuff in the battle for independence. Okay, I can't do that. Now, all I can do is use my voice and my position. And in the end, if that voice gives someone a moment of inspiration, a second of courage, or an idea to hold strong, to keep the nerve and the resolve, then I am more than grateful for the privilege of still continuing to do my bit to construct a world that is much better than the world I have lived through for the last 30, 40 years of my professional career, where I have seen the worst of inhumanities being visited on fellow human beings in every continent that I have worked at. So it is, if you like, a sense of mission that I cannot betray these people. I may not be able to save them by physical act, but I can at least not run away from the battle.
Absolutely. Wow, Professor Kapila, as usual, it was a very intriguing conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your voice. Thank you for your encouragement. And it does mean a lot. You said, if I give up, what is the message sent to these people? And that's a very powerful statement. So thank you for all you do. Thank you for coming back on the show. I look forward to talking to you again, and hopefully it's, a year and a half, we're not having the same conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lex. And my thoughts are with you and all your people.
Thank you.
Thank you.